Hi, in this video I am going to cover the topic, hopefully not too boring a topic, of the various things that Fvwm does when it starts up. Now you might think that that is actually a boring topic, but one of the interesting things is that I've had a couple of questions about this quite recently, and it occurred to me that because of the age of Fvwm, that it's had lots of different ways of achieving much the same thing bolted on over the years. And that's understandable. The window manager itself is, I think, at least 25 years, if not older, in the version that most people have been using it in. And various attempts at improving things, though good at the time, can often lead to confusion, particularly if someone is using a configuration file off the internet, or they've decided, say, to resurrect their configuration file from 10, 15 years ago. Now, in most cases, I expect that configuration file to still work, but that doesn't mean to say that there aren't some surprises along the way. So the topic of initialization is a little complex, but I also plan on talking a little bit about some sort of best practices that you might want to consider if you're having to make changes to your configuration file. So I think I'll start at the very beginning, which is, what does Fvwm do when you tell it to start? Now, for the purposes of this conversation, we are assuming that somebody has a configuration file that Fvwm is reading in. So as part of its initialization sequence, one of the things it does, apart from a whole bunch of xlib stuff that I'm not going to cover, is it calls a function called setrcdefaults. And it always calls this function, regardless of whether you have a configuration file that you're loading in or not. So the definition of this function looks like this. And it exists to serve as a complete bare bones. So if somebody has a configuration file where they didn't define, say, a start function or a menu or some sort of color, then it's very likely that Fvwm will inherit these properties and nothing else. By and large, though, most people never see the entries that are defined here because their configuration file has already overloaded them. Now, one interesting point of note is, if you were trying to debug something within Fvwm, or if you wanted to just see what this looked like, you are able to start Fvwm and tell it its configuration file is dev null, and at that point Fvwm would read the contents of this function and go no further in looking for any other file except for one, which I'll come on to. So all this function does is it defines a bunch of properties, one of which is some styles for some windows, and a start function, which is empty, as well as some other properties here. It also reads the default configuration file as well, if it can find it. So most of this is now historical, but nonetheless it still gets read. So if we were to look at that, we can see that, ignoring the background color, which we never set, I have a built-in menu, which is very much like this. You can see it's got load default config, it's got restart, Fvwm, and it's got quit. So this menu is very much here. I have a window xterm, which is highlighted in grey when it's focused and darker grey when it's not. That comes from this definition up here. the title is centered. So yeah, proving that, you know, this function still does what you think it does. Lastly, there is this here, which is also read in. So let's have a look at this, because this file, config fvwm defaults, this is the more interesting one, because this does supplement a user's configuration file, because not every user will override some of the contents that's in here. So let's have a quick look. So this is that file, and out of the box, this file defines various things, such as the window list function behavior. So when you are using, say, Alt Tab, for instance, the way in which windows are managed when you go between them is you call this function every single time, which means that you de-iconify the window, you change the focus, you raise the window, and then you move the pointer to it. 5p actually puts it somewhere up here. The active window func is the same thing, but for EWMH, which I'm not going to cover. Urgency func is interesting. Not all windows respond to this, but Fvwm has the ability to handle windows that set the urgency bit, and in this case, it does exactly the same thing as the window list func, more or less. And then there are some default styles around positioning, and then some key bindings, which most people end up overwriting. So this is the important file, because this is the one that actually sets up some of the sort of behind the scenes behavior that most people may not even bother checking. And so when we're done with that, and we read this file in, we drop down and we start looking at finding a user configuration file to load in. And that's pretty much it. So there is a sort of, if you like, a hierarchy, a order of dependence that Fvwm goes through in order to read your custom configuration file. It doesn't just jump straight to reading that. There is still a lot of state that's read in, which I've just demonstrated. And I think sometimes, you know, that's where the confusion can come from, particularly if you've overwritten something which you weren't expecting, because you can actually lose some of that functionality. But implied then in reading your configuration file is what happens, because it's not a case of just reading the file in line by line. There are certain implied things which Fvwm will do when it reads in that configuration file, which is why the sort of ordering is so important. So this is my personal configuration file, which shouldn't come as a surprise, I guess, that it's incredibly old and I don't really maintain it very well. I add to it, but it's a pretty big mess. I'm not too worried about that. But the way that this configuration file is read in, excuse me, the way that this configuration file is read in is such that it is read top down, line by line, but not every line is guaranteed to be executed at the point it's read in. And so now the ordering becomes important. So I'm not going to go through my configuration file, except to say that most of what you're seeing on screen here as I'm scrolling is read in and acted upon and stored. The one thing that is important is that there are functions which won't get enacted at the point that they're read in. So if you think about start function, the thing to note here is if this had been at the top of my file and Fvwm had read this in, it would have read this in just fine. It wouldn't have done anything with it until it finished reading this whole file. And that's important because the way that we add information to our start function is defined by this plus operator. And so because of that, I could, if I wanted to, down here, have a line that looks like that. And what Fvwm would do with that is it would actually add that no op call to the end of the definition, which in this case would actually run after this line. So the top-down ordering is logical. It explains why we're able to add things to functions without grouping commands together, because this plus command is clever enough to know the context it was last called in. So if I were to do this, for instance, then what would happen here is, because the last add to func call was start function, this plus operator would be appending to the last add to func line, which in this case was start function. And that plus operator works in the same way as I've just described it with menus as well. So it's the same concept. So Window Manager reads the file top down, and when it's read everything in, the next thing it does is it will then look to see what's in the start function. And that is our first entry point, start function. And if I just find that, when we come to look at that, we always run the start function after we finish reading in the file, and that's the first thing that will happen. And then if we're done with that, then we look at the init function as well, providing that we're not restarting. So configuration files of old would always have had an init function. Some of them have a start function as well. So in this example, I have an init function that starts next term, sets the background color to something, opens a pager and runs a command. And then on this start function, I'm only running an next term with Midnight Commander if we are initializing for the first time. And I can prove that if I go here. So here's my X term, here's my Midnight Commander window, here's X logo, and here's Fvwm pager. But you'll notice actually that the ordering was actually slightly different, and that's because there is no guarantee of enforced operations between these commands running and us calling the start function followed by init function. Or put differently, we don't block based on those commands because they're executed immediately. If we really cared about the ordering of things, then there are some things that we can do. Okay. So really and truthfully, over time, I think start function has sort of become the function where everything should be defined, whether it is at first startup or init time, at restart, at exit. And the reason we can do that is because this test command, this test operator, has conditions whereby if you're restarting, you can test for that in the same way you can test for init as well. And implicitly, start function runs when you restart Fvwm as well. So if we changed our start function to just that, you can see that I have another Midnight Commander window. If I did that again, you'd see a third one come up. And that's the only thing that's being added to each time because unconditionally that is being always started. Okay. So the other question that I sometimes get asked is, what about modules? When does it make sense to load those? Well, you could, if you wanted to, have a line in here, such as this. What do you think would happen if I were to restart now? Would you expect to see that pager there or not? Yeah, you did. What would you expect to see if I restarted now? It's still there. And the reason for that is because on restart, we're still reading that file in. So modules don't necessarily have to be started from a start function. It might not make sense to do so. It depends on what you are trying to do and what makes sense. So you don't have to. Personally, I think it might make sense because it at least logically groups commands together, and so you've got one place where you are able to change the logic of what's happening at, be it startup or initialization time or what have you. So the test command here is really quite powerful and should definitely be used, and I recommend particularly around the sort of initialization. So the way that you would essentially remove one layer of abstraction would be to move the contents of the initialization function to here. Just have entries like that, and there's nothing more to say really. One of the other things that I also notice with configuration files from time to time is some people don't always put a second exec for an external command that they wish to run. So the first exec with a capital E, as I've got it here, is actually a command internal to Fvwm, whereby it says run the next command through $shell. And if you do that, that's perfectly valid. But the problem is if you don't, if you leave it like that, you're not removing the shell that spawn next turn, so you end up with zombie shells, which is not particularly helpful. So the second exec just, the second exec just kicks that shell out of the way and replaces that with X-term, which just helps things greatly, particularly around zombie processes and what have you. Okay. I think that's probably about all I'd say around initialization. Is focus on start function, use the test command to affect at what point during the execution of Fvwm you want certain things to happen, i.e. init, restart, quit, etc. And then remove your init function completely as it's no longer necessary, and maybe think about where particular modules should be started, whether they're in a start function or not. And just bear in mind that the file is read top down and the ordering is important. So I suppose one last thing in sort of true Colombo style, this explains why it's important to generalize before you specialize in terms of your style lines. So you'll notice here, for instance, that I have a whole bunch of styles that I want to affect all windows for. And then specifically, I've got per application styles where they're either defined solely for that particular window or application, or I am explicitly overriding something that I've generalized up here, except for that line. But this is very important because this catches a lot of people out where they're copying and pasting examples from the internet, say, and things don't work how they intended. And that's purely because Fvwm really does treat this file when it's read in as top down. So the ordering, particularly around specialization and generalization, matters a lot. So that's worth bearing in mind as well. Okay, well, that may or may not, by example, have helped certain people. I hope it has. If you do have any questions, let me know and I'll try and answer them. You can always find me on IRC if you need to. All right, thank you very much for listening, and I'll catch you in the next one.